So how do we as managers know when we're communicating effectively? Let's imagine we had a magic wand that we could wave and all of a sudden we're communicating perfectly. How would that change an organization? Would productivity increase? Would our employees be happier? Well, the dilemma that this magic wand creates is that we don't know when we're communicating effectively. And why that's so important is because our success as managers depends on our ability to communicate effectively. So, what to do? That's where our author offers some approaches to us called Examining Communication Approaches in Chapter 2 of our textbook. In fact, his point has three aspects to it. Number one, make sure as managers we communicate clearly. Number two, make sure we do everything we can to help our employees understand. And number three, create an atmosphere where employees feel safe to challenge us, to debate us, to critique us, because when they do, that's where we can have a discussion, a very active and a safe, although very fruitful discussion and an energetic discussion of how our ideas differ from one another. And from those differences will emerge new ideas. And new ideas lead to creativity. And creativity leads to increased productivity, which increases the value of our organization. So how do we get there? Well, the author talks about three approaches to communication. Number one is called the arrow approach. Number two is called the circuit approach. And number three is called, very strange but very interesting, communication as dance. So, in the next few minutes we're going to take a look at each of these three and how they can contribute to our ability to communicate effectively. First, the arrow approach. Now, in the arrow approach, it's kind of represented by this diagram. This is an engineer's chart, and I'm not going to get into the details about encoding and decoding, but what I want to call your attention to is the direction of the line that moves like this. It's one direction. What that means is that in the arrow approach, the manager is only concerned with what he or she has to say. So, if we look at it from this perspective and judging effectiveness, how does the manager know if they're effective? Well, as a manager, if I can successfully transform my thoughts into words in a way where they're consistent and precise and clear, then I know I'm being effective. I also know I'm being effective if I come across with credibility and with authority, because it communicates I know what I'm talking about, and it communicates I have expectations for you to listen to this information and to take action on it. And if you do, we can judge effectiveness in terms of results. Do I get the objective that I want through the way I've communicated, the expectations I've given you, and what I expect you to do as a result? There are communication breakdowns, though, with this one-way kind of communication, the arrow approach, almost like I'm pulling back an arrow and releasing it, one-way communication. That's why it's named arrow. What might be some of the communication breakdowns? After all, I've been clear. I've been very concise. I've been very direct. So what can go wrong? What can go wrong is if my listeners don't listen in the first place. My instructions were very clear. Didn't they look at my PowerPoint? I said everything I needed to say in my email. Didn't they read my email? What were they doing when I was talking? Weren't they listening? So communication breakdowns can occur in this approach, but when they occur according to the manager using an arrow approach, it's because of an error on the part of the listener, not because of what the manager says. Where did this approach come from? Why is it so one way? Well, it comes from managers who have a technical background, like engineers, who are faced with a problem, they think about the solution, they come up with the solution, they capture it, write it down, and then it becomes a design, sort of like this has been a design. Their communication is approached in the same way. They see a problem, they think about it, They put their thoughts into words and they communicate it, and they expect people to follow it. Now this sounds very harsh, but in fact it doesn't need to be harsh. I'll give you an example. Think about a GPS. You have a problem. You need to get to a particular destination. You don't know where it is. So what to do? You enter the information in the GPS. It listens to you in its own way, decodes what you say. It calculates the best route, and then it gives you information like an arrow, one direction, one-way communication that tells you where to go, mile by mile, step by step, corner by corner. It's going to tell you when to turn, it's going to tell you how many miles you have, and it's going to tell you when you've reached your destination very clearly. All you have to do is follow it. So the origins of the arrow approach, they're sound. They come from a technical way of thinking that you then translate into words. How do you know if you're effective? How do you evaluate your effectiveness? Well, it's very simple. Effective expression equals effective communication. That's the arrow approach, one-way communication. Second approach that the author talks about is the circuit approach. It's very different from the arrow approach because the circuit approach is two-way communication. So let's take a look at the author's diagram. Again, kind of a technical diagram, but what I want you to concentrate on is that its flow is as a circle, which means not only am I going to tell you what I expect from you, not only am I going to give you information, but I want to check back that you've understood it. So it's me giving you information and you giving me information back to clarify that in fact you have understood. So we'll look at the circuit approach in the same way that we looked at the arrow approach in terms of judging effectiveness. First of all, are people listening? Listening is key in the circuit approach because the circuit approach is all about making sure understanding is taking place. For people to listen, they need to feel safe. They need to feel included. They want to feel appreciated. They want to feel valued. And if they do, they'll let their guard down and then they'll let the information that I'm giving them come in so that they can listen to it and let me know whether or not they have understood. That's how we judge the effectiveness of it, if understanding takes place. And what about communication breakdowns? Well, as in any kind of communication, there are risks for breakdowns. When might they occur, or how might they occur in the circuit approach? Well, if people aren't listening, for one thing, they can't possibly understand. They may have other things on their mind. So, listening errors, of course, could cause communication breakdowns in the circuit approach. But there's also something else. We make the assumption, or at least managers using the circuit approach, make the assumption that when people understand, that leads to effective communication. Makes sense on the surface. The problem with it is, just because we understand doesn't necessarily mean we're going to agree. And so people may have their own perspectives, their own ideas that in a circuit approach you may never hear about because what you're concerned about and what you're looking for is a confirmation only of understanding. So it has limitations. People may have their own ideas. Worse, they may have hidden agendas. They may disagree with you entirely and because of that go off and do something else. So that's a big risk. But again, the key here is developing a relationship, developing a feeling of camaraderie and inclusion and that we're a team. And where did this come from? Certainly not a technical background like in the arrow approach. It actually comes from a transition in human relations theory from scientific management, where the manager gets his or her information from science, has the one right best approach, and then sends that approach in a one-way direction or one-way communication. Human relations theory is very different. Human relations theory says that people want to feel valued. They want to feel included. They want to feel appreciated. And so that's where this approach came from. The focus of the circuit approach is on the relationship between the manager and the employees. How do you evaluate the circuit approach? You do so again very simply. Unlike the arrow approach, which is effective expression leads to effective communication, in this case it's understanding leads to effective communications. Limitations with that, yes, but that's the perspective from the circuit manager. In a way, these two approaches, arrow and circuit, seem mutually exclusive, and in many ways they are. So the author suggests a third approach. And the third approach is what he calls communication as dance. I'm going to put up a picture that I found that I think is a lot of fun and really gets across some of the main points of communication as dance. Let's take a look at it. So clearly what you see here are people that look like they're having fun, but there's a lot in the picture that we can pull out as far as some really useful ways of comparing dance with communication. For one thing, there are different colors, which suggests to us that people have different communication styles, doesn't it? We communicate differently. We have different ideas. We have different agendas. Some of us like to be very active while we're communicating. Some of us are much more still and quiet when we're communicating. So we've got different styles here represented by different colors. There are also patterns in a dance. And you can see a pattern in this dance is a lot of movement. In fact, I'll call it free form movement. And the patterns actually suggest to us that there are rules for dancing this way. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think a kind of free-flowing approach to dancing has rules to it, and yet it does. The rules aren't dictating to us, but they're telling us what to do as we're dancing in this way or in order to dance in this way. We're going to move our hands. We're going to really kind of move in our own way to the music, ways that might not be exactly the same as this person over here, and may be very different from this person over here. So our body positions are going to change as the music moves us. The rule is then free flow in response to how the music moves you. That's a rule. There are rules in communication as well. They tell us how to communicate with one another. In fact, there are two rules the author talks about. One rule is what he calls an interpretive rule. It tells us how to pull meaning out of what we hear. For example, if I'm your manager, you're telling me about your idea, and you hear and you see this. Hey, tell me more. Your rule for interpreting that is going to pull cues from what you've heard and what you've seen and tell you something. It's going to give you the interpretation that I am interested and I want to hear more, compared with, tell me more. Now you're seeing something very differently, and you're hearing a different tone in my voice. You're seeing sternness on my face. You're seeing more rigidity. And so your rule for interpreting tells you to interpret that very differently, that I'm challenging you, that I'm very dubious of what you're saying, and I'm critical, and you're on the defensive, and I'm intimidating you. So we have rules for communication that tell us how to interpret the meaning from what we see and from what we hear. Another kind of rule is what he calls a regulative rule, and that tells us what to do in communication. For example, how do you start a conversation? Well, we have a rule for that, kind of a guideline for that. If we want there to be a free-flowing conversation, as conversations are, we need to find a way to start a conversation that's very low risk. So we may say, hey, what do you think of this weather today? It was so hot yesterday and now it's cold. So we're asking the person to open up to us. We may also say, have you seen any good movies lately? Well, it's an open-ended question in a way that invites a response. We want to hear what the other person has to say. It's low risk. So to start a conversation, the rule is ask a low risk kind of question or talk about a low risk kind of subject, compared with breaking the rule, which is, don't you ever go to any movies? Now that's not going to open up a conversation. In fact, it'll probably shut it down before it starts. So we have interpretive rules and we have regulative rules, just as there are rules in dance. All right, let's pull all this together. What will communicating as dance do? What it does is it opens up an atmosphere and a culture of cooperation, of coordination, of moving together, and of moving in different directions, so that when you hear what I have to say, and when you demonstrate to me that you've understood it, you feel free to challenge it. You feel free to offer your own ideas. You feel free to disagree with me. And from that comes new ideas. And from new ideas come innovation. And from innovation comes productivity. And from productivity, we increase the value of the organization. So pulling it all together, looking at the arrow approach, one-way communication, we have clarity. We must be precise as managers to make sure that what we're thinking comes across in words that communicates what we're thinking. And that's good. From a circuit approach, we want to make sure that understanding is taking place. We want to make sure there's a relationship, that people do feel appreciated, that people do feel valued, that people feel connected with us, and that people communicate to us that they've understood what we want them to understand. And from communication as dance, we really pull it all together so that we create that atmosphere of safety where people do express ideas and people feel free and safe and comfortable to disagree with each other, so that we could explore all these ideas and not just be limited to a very narrow perspective of one way and the only way, because then we become rigid and the organization will become crippled as far as productivity is concerned. It can't grow. But through a communication as dance approach, taking the best of arrow, clear communication, taking the best of circuit, understanding, we build this atmosphere of exchange. We build this atmosphere of growing together by communicating. So that's what the chapter is all about. We don't have this magic wand. We can't ever be sure that we're communicating effectively. But we can increase our chances of that happening and help our organizations by speaking clearly, by making sure we understand one another, and creating that atmosphere of safety so that we can really challenge, learn, and grow from one another.